start, can I ask you to ensure if you have your mobile phone with you, that you switch to flight mode or turn it off, whichever happens to work for you. And let me introduce myself. My name is Reverend Paul Creasy. I'm one of the ministers of this congregation here in Carlton at the Church for Nations. We are a church that has been serving this community for over 150 years, serving the most marginalised people in Carlton. So welcome to our place. It's good to be here. We would like to start off by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respect to elders both past and present. Have a great night tonight. I'm sure it's going to be challenging and insightful. Thank you. Kristen.
Good evening. My name is Chris Gordon. I help organise some of the events that happen at readings. It's a pleasure to have you all here on behalf of HarperCollins and on behalf of Readings and the Church of All Nations. Please know that you are so welcome. My role here is not only to introduce our speakers, although, let's be honest, do they need an introduction, but to also tell you a little bit about the housekeeping, about how the night is going to go. So first of all, I guess we'll have a bit of a conversation for, 40-45 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for questions. And it's at this point in the evening that I'm going to see if we can all work together as a team. We are just taking questions. We're not going to be taking personal stories of trips to Iceland. We're not going to be talking about the time that you nearly ran off the road because you were listening to Richard, who was doing a terrific podcast, and you were so involved that you became distracted. No, my friends. This is not the time for that. This is about questions about the book or the process of writing. Is that okay? Brilliant. There will not be an opportunity to get your book signed afterwards. And why? Because it is already signed. You have to flip through your copy, the first edition copy, and flip through those photos, and then you'll see the signatures on the publishing page. I think that's pretty much all I need to say in terms of housekeeping. And now all I need to do is introduce you to two blokes that met, had a conversation, started a friendship, and decided to go overseas together. And then, because they could, wrote about it. Let's make Richard, ABC, podcaster extraordinary, very welcome, and his dear friend Kari, who is a teacher who has travelled all the way from Queensland to be here on the very first day of production of the very first event of the beautiful Saga land. Let's make him very welcome.
I'm dying to hear all your travel anecdotes about Iceland. As soon as you can do it, that'd be great. Good evening, everyone. My name's Fidler
Fidler Kari Gislason.
And like Chris says, this project started with our friendship. We met each other about 5 years ago or so, when Kari came on my conversations program as a guest. Kari had written this beautiful memoir called The Promise of Iceland, and I kind of got to know Kari before I even met him, having read this memoir. He came on the show, and we hit it off really well. And when we finished putting the show together, we just kept on talking.
Actually, Richard walked me out of the building after the show, and he took me to the elevator. And the elevator doors opened up, and we started talking about history. I think we started off talking about Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General.
Oh, yes.
Something like that. And then we moved on to other topics, and the lift was closed. And they opened again, and we still didn't say goodbye, and they closed again. And about an hour later, I think we were still standing there talking about fascinating historical subjects.
That's right, holding up well-meaning program makers in the ABC while we're nattering on. And then we discovered that we're both roughly the same age. We both...
It's a little bit older.
A little bit older, just a couple of years older. Not anything that's noticeable, though, I think you'll find. And we both had young families, and it happened we lived in the same suburb as well. And we had the same taste in books and in music. So at the beginning of 2015, when Kari told me he was going to Iceland, I said, oh man, I'm coming with you. Because Kari was born in that faraway island of Iceland.
I was born in the 1970s, and I grew up in a very different Iceland from the one you're probably thinking of now. It was very remote. It was really the end of the world, and it was just a kind of outstation in the North Atlantic. But it was also an idyllic place to grow up. Reykjavik, in particular, was a city where the kids could do whatever they wanted. It was a really free place to grow up, and I had wonderful memories of those early years.
Now, these days when you go to Iceland, any people here to Iceland? Oh wow, look at that. Okay.
I've got a lot of stories to go through.
We'll take them one by one and you may notice that Icelanders, these days they're quite friendly, but it wasn't always that way. They used to be quite dour and taciturn people.
This is not a very nice thing to say about Icelanders, but he's right. Icelanders used to see smiling as a sign of weakness, and laughter as an outrageous display of the ego. And it wasn't until the tourists started to arrive that Icelanders began to relax a little bit. But it took a bit of doing, actually, Richard. The Icelandic government decided to run an ad campaign. It was the It's Okay to Smile campaign. And it just sort of showed everyday situations. I don't know, shopping, for example, and you go up with your shopping items and you say hello to the person who's serving it, and you smile. And it showed the person smiling. And everyone was amazed by this, that you really could just smile any old time.
Iceland, I think, is possibly the most fiercely beautiful country in the world. It's an island on the edge of the Arctic Circle in the North Atlantic, and it straddles two gigantic tectonic plates, the Eurasian plate and the North American plate. And they sort of grind against each other in a zigzag line across the middle of Iceland. So these tectonic plates are constantly pushing up mountains and volcanoes, but at the same time there are these massive glaciers that are pushing back down. So the whole landscape exists in this constant state of slow motion disruption. Now, Iceland existed like this, uninhabited, lonely, for countless millennia, until the Middle Ages and the arrival of the Vikings.
Now, the Vikings arrived in Iceland in the 870s from Western Norway, and they arrived in Iceland because, I'm assuming you know much of this, but because of the rule of one Haraldur Hárfagri, who I'm sure you've all heard of.
We all know him.
Now, Haraldur Hárfagri, it means Harold the beautifully haired. Now, Harold had very, very beautiful hair. He was king of Norway and he was renowned for it, but it wasn't always the case. For many years, he was known as Harold the Shaggy. Now, the reason he was called Harold the Shaggy was because he'd made a promise. He wasn't going to have a haircut until he had the whole of Norway under his control. Eventually, he managed it, and he had his haircut, after which he was known as Harold the beautifully haired. Now, Harold was a rather tyrannical ruler, and the best of the Norwegians, the independent-minded ones, left.
Yeah, the top shelf Norwegians, like the really first-rate guys who didn't care for the tyranny of Harold the beautiful hair, they just got out. They had to leave.
Norwegians don't necessarily agree with this version. But the very, very excellent Norwegians travelled across the North Atlantic, and they travelled to Iceland. They had a ritual. As they neared the coastline, they would take a pillar of timber, and they would throw it overboard and follow that piece of wood until it reached the coastline. And where that piece of wood landed was where they would build their farms. And Reykjavik, which means Smoky Bay from the steam that rises there, was where Ingólfur Árnason, the first settler, built his farm.
Now, the interior of Iceland is pretty much uninhabitable. It's pretty much a grey, rocky tundra. So all the farms that were built were around the coast, where the land could be very, very beautiful. And in no time at all the farmland was taken up. And within 130 years, by the time we get to the end of the first Christian millennium, the year 1000, you have a situation where in the mainland of Europe, they're cringing. They're anticipating the first millennium, which many expected would mean the second coming of Christ in wrath and in glory. But in Iceland, it was a whole different thing. In the year 1000, Icelanders were doing extraordinary things, and it became one of the most vibrant and dynamic societies in all of Europe. This was a time when Vikings from Iceland left to go east, all the way down to Constantinople, now the city of Istanbul, to fight in the Roman Emperor's Varangian Guard. This was the Emperor's elite troop of mercenaries, which were all Vikings, made from Sweden, Norway, and from Iceland and Denmark, because they had no interest in the court politics at the time. Anyone been to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul? I don't know if you went up to the upper balustrade in the Hagia Sophia. There's a marble balustrade there. And there are Viking runes carved into that balustrade. It's graffiti. And it says, Halfdan wrote this.
He was a Norwegian Viking.
A Norwegian one, not one of the clever
not
ones.
one of the clever
Icelandic
ones.
Halfdan wrote this. So they were serving in the Varangian Guard and being sent to the Holy Land and to Sicily and other places in Asia Minor. But meanwhile, there were other Vikings who went even wilder places, even further into the unknown. The ones who went west out of Iceland to found a settlement in Greenland. And there are those like Leif Erikson who went even further, all the way to America, and formed settlements there. The Icelanders are the first Europeans to come to the Americas, not Christopher Columbus. And they were there and formed a settlement there 500 years before Columbus left Spain. So this is what Iceland was like in these days, a dynamic and rich and exciting place. But perhaps for our purposes, the most important thing that was going on at the time was they were developing the poetic language that would become the basis of the sagas of Iceland.
The sagas are Iceland's national treasures. Saga just means a telling, a story. And the sagas of Iceland are the stories that the first settlers told about each other. In Europe in the Middle Ages, the default learning language was Latin, of course. But for some reason in Iceland, Icelanders began to write about their own lives. And they began to write about those lives in Icelandic. And they produced this unique body of literature called the family sagas. Now, these are stories about the first settlers, but more particularly, they're stories about family, about how families get along or often don't get along, and how families in a small country on the edge of the world often start fighting with each other.
Now, these sagas, I found, are thrilling to read. They're curiously modern. And the Vikings in them and their family lives are quite recognizable to us as modern people. They have all the emotions we feel, they care about the same things we care. But there's one real critical difference, and that's the Viking concept of honor. Now, honor isn't like love. It's not ever flourishing. Honor is more like currency, and you can only have so much of it. And that means you can't earn honor. You have to take it from someone else. And the way they hold to their honor, the men and women of the sagas, particularly the women, is terrifying at times. Now, I didn't know anything about the sagas when I first met Kari. He started talking about them, and I said, oh, okay, well, give me an example of the sagas. And he told me this story, which is a story which we've got in Saga land. It's the saga story of Gunnar and his wife, Helga.
This is where you should get comfortable. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi was the most promising and able young man of his day. He was tall with fair hair, and he was athletic in all things. They say he could jump as far backwards as he could forwards. He was a great runner. He swam like a seal. When he wanted to mount his horse, he'd run up behind it with his halberd and pole vault into the saddle. He was popular too, slow to make friends, but unbreakably loyal to those who were close. And he was an expert bowman, more accurate and deadly with the weapon than any other man in Iceland, although it was also said of Gunnar that he hated to kill. When he was a young man, Gunnar travelled to Norway, where he performed great acts of courage and daring. He returned to Iceland with wealth and honour. In summer, he made the journey to Thingvellir to take part in the annual parliament. People couldn't stop looking at him, for he seemed to have everything. He was handsome, and he had travelled widely. Gunnar arrived at Thingvellir wearing a beautiful cloak that he'd acquired on his travels and a golden bracelet given to him by Hakon, an earl in Norway. He walked along the gap in the rifts, past the stream, and then he saw the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Her name was Hallgerð. She wore a red dress decorated with ornaments and a coat trimmed with lace. Her hair was long and fair. Gunnar approached her and asked if she would sit down with him for a moment. He began to tell her about his travels, and she listened to him as he spoke. Eventually he asked, "Hallgerð, are you married?" "You can't possibly be interested in that," she replied. "What if I am? Then you should go and speak to my father and my uncle." Gunnar went to see them. They welcomed him and listened to his plea for Hallgerð's hand in marriage. Then they said to him, "Gunnar, we like you. You're a good man. We don't think you should marry Hallgerð." There were good reasons for this. Hallgerð had been married twice before, and both marriages ended badly. In the first, she'd been forced to marry a man she didn't love. They argued, and Hallgerð's husband hit her across the face. When her foster father, a man who cared for Hallgerð perhaps a little bit too much, found out, he found a new resting place for his axe in the back of her husband's head. She then married a man that she did love, but they also argued, and once again Hallgerð was struck across the face. When Hallgerð's foster father saw her, she noticed the anger and told him to leave the matter alone. It was between her and her husband. But I'm afraid to say that he once again found a new resting place for his axe in the back of her husband's head. Hallgerð had lost two husbands. One she didn't mind losing, and one she grieved over, but Gunnar knew what he wanted. Something very basic had passed between them, and they needed each other. Against the advice of her kinsman, Gunnar married Hallgerð and took his new bride back to Hlíðarendi, his farm in the south of Iceland. It was never going to be easy for Hallgerð to settle into her new home and the district to which Gunnar introduced her. He was a new woman, and a rather proud one. There was some resistance to her arrival on the part of Gunnar's friends and family. Of course, they knew about Hallgerð's reputation and what had happened to the first two husbands. Gunnar's best friend was a lawyer named Njál. The two men were very different. Gunnar, a man of action. Njál, much more given to words. But their friendship suited both men. They complemented one another and understood each other's very different strengths. Njál could already tell that Hallgerð's arrival would not bring good luck to Gunnar, and he disapproved of the union. But he invited Gunnar and Hallgerð to a feast at his farm, not far from Hlíðarendi. The day of the feast came, and Gunnar and Hallgerð rode across the pastures and the flats that lay between the two farms. But as soon as they arrived, there was trouble. It came down to the seating arrangements. Hallgerð wasn't given the seat of honor that she'd expected. "I'm not sitting at the end of the bench like some old wench," said Hallgerð. "I'll decide that," said Njál's wife, Bergþóra. When Bergþóra came back later with a basin of water for washing, Hallgerð saw her hostess's fingers and said, "Your fingernails are rotten." Bergþóra replied, "At least I haven't killed off any husbands." The women hated each other instantly, and not long after that feast, they began a feud. First of all, they conducted it through their slaves, whom they pressed into killing one another. But gradually the feud escalated until it got quite close to Gunnar and Njál. Their kinsmen were dragged into the dispute, and for a moment it looked like the households would have to fight it out. Thanks mainly to Njál's foresight and goodwill, the friends were able to stop it from going too much further. Njál put his friendship with Gunnar ahead of the demands of the feud. For a while, there was peace in the district. But Njál and Hallgerð had made their mark. During periods of austerity, the farmers in the district relied on each other for help, and there came a time when Gunnar needed help. There was a shortage of hay, and his livestock was in danger. Gunnar knew that his neighbor Otkel had a surplus of hay, so he visited Otkel to buy some. But Otkel was jealous of his great neighbor, and wanting to steal some of his honor for himself, he refused the request. When Halgerd found out about this, she was furious. She sent another one of her slaves to visit Otkel and told him to burn down the house and bring something back for her larder. The slave returned with cheese. The next time Gunnar had visitors, Halgerd brought out the cheese and served it to Gunnar's friends. Gunnar reeled back. "Where did you get the cheese, Halgerd?" She answered, "Don't concern yourself with domestic matters." In front of the others, he hit her across the face. Halgerd said, "I will remember that blow." Gunnar's reputation as a warrior and now as a local leader caused him problems. People in the district were jealous of him and started to band together to bring him down. Some slandered him, while others tried to bait him into fights. Eventually, a big fight did break out, not far from his farm, beside the river Rangau, and Gunnar was forced to kill a number of his enemies. Between them, he and his brother Kolskir killed 8 men, including Otkel, the farmer who denied Gunnar the sale of hay. At its close, Gunnar turned to his brother and asked, "Why do I find it harder to kill than other men do?" He was good at fighting, but he hated it. He began to rely more and more on the advice of his friend Njal. He consulted Njal on most matters, especially how to deal with the growing hostility toward him. Njal gave him one very particular piece of advice: never kill twice in the same family. "I would never do that," said Gunnar. "But if you do," continued Njal, "then you must accept the settlement made for you by men of goodwill." Gunnar gave his word that he would. His enemies, meanwhile, kept at him. Because Gunnar had killed Otkel, Otkel's son was now honor bound to go after Gunnar. Eventually, he too fell to Gunnar's sword. Against his own nature and wishes, Gunnar had killed twice in the same family, and the matter was referred to the Althing for arbitration and settlement. Gunnar hadn't really been to blame for the killings. His enemies had provoked and attacked him constantly. But all the same, the men of goodwill came up with this settlement. Gunnar would have to leave Iceland for 3 years of exile, after which time he could return. Njal told him that if he accepted this settlement, he would eventually prosper again and live a long and honorable life. And so Gunnar agreed. He and his brother would leave for 3 years. On the day set down for their departure, the brothers rode down the slopes of Hlíðarendi. But then Gunnar's horse tripped, and he was forced to jump clear. He turned around and he looked at the farm, and he said these words that every child in Iceland knows: Fögur hlíðin. It means the slopes are beautiful. I will not go. His brother was shocked. Don't please your enemies by doing this. I won't stay with you in Iceland. Gunnar rode back to his farm on his own, and they say that Halgerd was very pleased to see him. Gunnar's enemies now had to attack. Gunnar had broken the settlement, and the next move was theirs. They approached Hlíðarendi, and they began their assault. It didn't start well. Gunnar had his bow, and he was able to keep the attackers at bay. They made one charge on the house, but were forced to retreat. Then they made a second attempt, this time trying to get into the house from the top. Gunnar was able to thrust his halberd up through the roof and push them back. The attackers gave up and began to ride away. But then Gunnar made a mistake. He spotted one of the attackers' arrows on the side of the house. He thought it would be fun to use it against his enemies, humiliating them as they retreated. He leant out of the window to fetch the arrow. "Leave it," said his mother, who saw what he was about to do. "You don't need it." Gunnar ignored her and reached for the arrow. As he did, one of the attackers saw the glint of the gold on the band of his arm. They thought, if Gunnar needs one of our arrows, he must be running out of his own. They resumed the attack, and this time with much more force and conviction. They hitched thick rope around the base of the turf roof and heaved it off. Now they could attack properly from above. Still, Gunnar had his bow, and he could defend himself with it. But eventually, the bowstring broke. He turned to Hallgerth and saw her long hair. "Give me some of your hair," he said. "Does very much depend on it?" she asked. "I need it to repair my bow. My life depends on it." "In that case, let me remind you of the time you hit me. I refuse." With that, the attackers came in. They hacked at Gunnar. He killed 2 men and wounded 8, but he was tiring, and they had the numbers. Finally, he tripped and, too weary to stand, fell down at the feet of his enemies. They crowded around him, and each of them stabbed him. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi was dead, killed in front of Hallgerð. Thank you.
It's a hell of a story, isn't it? And it doesn't go where you think it's going to go at all. To me, this is the pleasure of the sagas, the rich pleasure of them. Together they form a monument of world literature that inspired writers like W.H. Auden and Jorge Luis Borges as well,
Tolkien.
Ted Hughes, Tolkien. Tolkien was mad about the sagas, loved them and adored them. So this was what we wanted to do. In going to Iceland together, we wanted to tell the saga stories in the places where they actually happened 1,000 years ago. So we went to Þingvellir, the open-air natural medieval parliament of Iceland. We went to Hlíðarendi, the farm. We went to places all around the island where these sagas took place to record these stories in the stones and streams of Iceland. But there was another reason why we wanted to go to Iceland, and it concerned itself with a family mystery.
The reason I'm from Iceland is down to my mother, Susan, an English Australian who in 1969 found herself alone. Her marriage to an Australian ended, and she decided to do something about it. She got on a boat to Japan, and then she got on another boat to Russia. Then she crossed Russia on the Trans-Siberian, and then she ended up in Oxford, working at the psychiatry clinic at the University of Oxford. And there she saw an ad in the newspaper: English-speaking secretary wanted, no tax payable. She applied for the ad and for the job, and she got it. The next day she went in to tell her boss that she was moving, and when she told him where she was going, he took her into the psychiatric ward, asked her to lie down, and said, "Are you mad?" It was a technical question. She was going to Iceland. She went to Reykjavik, and she started work at a firm of importers. Now, as I was saying before, it was very unusual in those days for Icelanders to smile. But there was one man in the firm who was a bit on the smiley side. And he would sort of linger around her office and even smile across the coffee room, which was unheard of. One day he started to follow her home. Now, these days we have laws about that sort of thing.
Call that stalking,
Stalking.
I think. Stalking, yes.
And then another day he started to throw things at her. Snowballs across the road. And I think these days we call that assault.
Assault, yes.
But in 1969, 1970 in Iceland, this was considered the height of romance. And they began a relationship. She worried about him though. He was 36, seemed all right. As my mother likes to say, he was clean. Why wasn't he married? So one day she asked him, why have you never married? And he said, well, of course I have. I am married. I have 5 children. How could you not know that? Because in Iceland, everyone knows everything about everyone else. They had a relationship, and the product of that relationship was one of your speakers today. You're not the product of
It's not me.
And my father made a request to my mother. He asked her never to reveal the secret of who he was, his identity. And my mother promised him that. We left Iceland when I was 10. We moved to England, and then we came to Australia, and the secret lived on until I was 27. And then I started a PhD in the Icelandic sagas. And it took me back to Iceland, and I decided to do something about this secret. I wrote to my father, and I told him it was over. And then I wrote to my siblings and told them they had a brother. They invited me to lunch the following Sunday, a family lunch. And miraculously, they welcomed me into their family. And my father was there, and his wife was there. At some point, my sisters decided that he and I should have a chat. So they set us up in a corner of the room, and my father sat me down and said, Kauri, what are you doing with your life? I said, I'm in literary studies. I'd like to write one day. He said, oh, that makes sense. Oh, why is that? Well, you know you're descended from Snorri Sturluson, don't you?
Snorri Sturluson is Iceland's national hero, one of its most important statesmen in its most critical period of its history, and the greatest of the saga authors. Now, most of the time we don't know who the saga authors were. They were nameless monks working in monasteries or somewhere writing them down. They didn't put their names to them. But we do know Snorri wrote 3 great sagas. He wrote Egil Saga, one of the greatest of the family sagas. He wrote the Heimskringla, a great rollicking history of the kings of Norway. And Snorri wrote the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda is the single most important source we have for all of Norse mythology. Most of what we know about Thor and Odin and Loki, the source of all these goddamn Marvel Comics movies that are comes from the pen of Snorri Sturluson, a medieval lawyer writing in an Icelandic farmhouse in the 13th century. Snorri is a man who's revered in Iceland today. There is a statue, a street, and a beer named after him. And he was murdered in his cellar in the year 1241. So this is what we went to do, to go to Iceland again, to find out if what Kari's father said was true, to find out if there was a bloodline connection between Kari and the greatest of the saga authors. So Iceland keeps the most comprehensive genealogical records in the world. They started right from the first settlers, keeping the records of who was the parent of whom, going all the way up to the present day. So that was our second mission. I also wanted to find out about Snorri Sturluson himself, the great father figure. He's like the Tolstoy or Shakespeare of Iceland. And so I then, while we were there, researched his life story, which is told in fits and starts in a saga called Sturlunga Saga. And yes, the greatest of the saga authors, but the person that emerged from those pages wasn't quite the person I thought we were looking for. And in fact, if anything, he's probably the single most person responsible for the destruction of Iceland's independence in the 13th century. So there was all that. We have this kind of overflowing cup of stories for this book. And there's also the stories of us together on the road and a bunch of ghost stories we picked up along the way as well, because Iceland's absolutely full of amazing ghost stories. Stories like the Utbadr, the ghost of an infant that's left out to be exposed, left out to die and be exposed in the cold that returns to haunt its mother. But the best story I found, the story I like the most, is the story of a Draugr, which is a restless ghost, a kind of a poltergeist. And it concerns the most haunted house in Reykjavik. Now, this is a house known as Höfti House. You probably might have seen it on your tourist trip there if you went to Iceland. It's this kind of timber, small-sized mansion that's on the outskirts of Reykjavik, on the edge of a motorway, surrounded by a grassy patch. It looks quite isolated and alone. This was a house that was built in the early 20th century for the French Consul General of the time. He in turn sold it to an Icelandic lawyer and poet named Einar Benediktsson. Now, Einar Benediktsson is the crucial figure here because he was well known as a poet, but also as a lawyer, as I said. And he was sent to the north of Iceland one day to take a deposition in a lurid murder case. It was a case whereby a brother and sister had conceived a child between them and then had murdered the child. So he was sent north to take testimony from the woman concerned, Solborg. What he didn't know was before she walked into the room for him to take her testimony, she'd consumed a vast amount of poison. And so she died this ghastly death at his feet, writhing around in front of him. It's awful. Now, Einar Benediktsson always said that Solborg's ghost followed him back to Reykjavik because thereafter, Höfti House, his home, became uninhabitable. There was the wall shaking, the pictures falling down. You know, it's on a fault line, you can explain that. But then there was the constant visitations of a spectral woman in white, appearing all the time and bothering him, not just in the nighttime, but in the daytime as well. Now, Einar was a man of reason and logic and the law. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he found the place uninhabitable, so he sold it. It was passed on from person to person, to family. No one could stay there very long. The British ambassador bought it in the 1950s, loved the story of the ghost, thought, I'll do it all up, restore it to its original. He had to get out after a couple of weeks. It was just too horrible to live in there. So they closed it up and they left it alone. And occasionally the Icelanders would hold state banquets there. Then it makes its reappearance in a bizarre episode in the mid-1980s, where it became the site of a summit between the US president and the Soviet president in Höfti House, the Reykjavik summit. So this is after it's been left alone. Höfti House remained quiet and dark for decades until October 1986, when it was announced that the two most powerful men in the world, US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, were coming to Reykjavik for a summit meeting. The Icelandic government offered them Höfti House as a venue. It would be no ordinary meeting. The hastily put together two-day summit would later be described as one of the strangest episodes in the annals of nuclear diplomacy. Now, on the eve of the summit, President Reagan was 75 years old and approaching the end of his second term in office. Unlike his predecessors, Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter, Reagan rarely chose to involve himself in the intricacies of policy, preferring to set the ideological direction of his administration from the White House and then let his staff get on with the details. One biographer of Reagan has likened the president to a child monarch, a naive and manipulable ruler, humoured and protected by his courtiers. But in Reykjavik, the aging child monarch finally broke through the constraints of his minders. He and Gorbachev came stunningly close to concluding the biggest arms control deal in history. Afterwards, the US media and America's allies wondered what on earth had happened in Höfti House. Now, one of Reagan's core beliefs, shared by many in his administration, was the belief that the communist Soviet Union was not merely a cynical, opportunistic world power, but a morally wicked entity, an evil empire that should not be accommodated, but should be confronted with superior military strength. Cold War tensions escalated dramatically during his first administration, and the world edged towards a thermonuclear catastrophe. Reagan's Secretary of Defense mused aloud about fighting a winnable nuclear war. Reagan himself had wondered aloud about that if the world was living through the end times, the Christian apocalypse foretold in the book of Revelation. But there was, however, another aspect of the president's personality that many of his aides and the press missed at the time: a utopian desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Reagan believed such weapons of mass destruction were sinful. In 1979, a year before winning the presidency, Reagan was taken on a tour of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, known as NORAD, their headquarters in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. This is the nuclear bunker that acts as an early warning center for potential missile attacks on the United States. Reagan marveled at this command center and likened it to the war room in Dr. Strangelove. For the first time, Reagan was introduced to the prevailing strategic doctrine that was known as MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, which held that mutual self-interest would constrain both the US and the Soviet Union from inflicting a nuclear holocaust upon the world. And on the flight back to California, Reagan expressed how shocked he was by the apparent absurdity of MAD. He likened it to, quote, two men pointing cocked and loaded pistols at each other's heads. The following year, Reagan won the presidency in a landslide. And when a group of advisors walked into the Oval Office and proposed an elaborate and expensive new scheme of missile defense, Reagan was easily persuaded to give the research his blessing. Now, the scheme was a very long way from realization. It was little more than a package of research proposals that were bundled together and came to be known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The scheme proposed to develop new technologies that would allow the US to knock down an enemy strategic nuclear ballistic missile in mid-flight. A fully functioning SDI would, in theory, create a virtual protective shield over the United States, making it safe from nuclear attack. Hostile missiles would be shot down from sophisticated laser weapons systems based on the ground and in space, which led journalists to dub the proposal Star Wars. Now, the president, a former Hollywood actor who sometimes confused fiction and reality, was attracted to the idea of X-ray lasers in space. It might have resonated in his mind with a movie he starred in from 1940 called Murder in the Air, in which he played secret agent Brass Bancroft, charged with protecting a superweapon, an inertia projector that would make the United States invincible in war, and in so doing, become the greatest force for world peace ever discovered. Reagan became so excited by the idea of the SDI, he came to believe it was his own idea. In March 1983, in a televised address from the White House, the president announced that the United States would pursue SDI research. The Soviet leadership, all too aware how far their pre-computer military systems lagged behind those of the United States, was badly spooked. Was it really possible that the Americans might be able just to shoot down all the Soviets' strategic missiles from space? The answer was a firm no. The idea amounted to shooting down a bullet with another bullet. SDI research, despite the expenditure of billions of dollars, never came close to a reliable working prototype. But the Soviets, and the US taxpayers for that matter, weren't to know this. Then in 1985, the leadership of the Soviet Union underwent generational change. After a succession of ailing geriatric leaders, the Communist Party hierarchy turned to a younger man to lead the USSR. The new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, understood the urgent need for greater openness and economic modernization, and he badly wanted an arms agreement with the United States that would allow him to redirect scarce resources away from the military and towards food, housing, and consumer goods. And he shared Reagan's moral revulsion towards the hair-trigger nuclear trap the two superpowers had built. In 1986, the moment was ripe for an arms deal. Most of the hardline anti-communists in the Reagan administration had been driven out by scandal or internal rivalries, and the two figures now closest to the president were his Secretary of State, George Shultz, and Reagan's wife, Nancy. who both urged him to come to an agreement with the Soviet leader and to build a legacy as a peacemaker. The first Reagan-Gorbachev summit was held in Geneva in November 1985, and a personal relationship of sorts was established between the two men, but little was accomplished beyond that. Over the following months, negotiations stalled, so Gorbachev wrote to Reagan, proposing they meet again, somewhere halfway between Washington and Moscow, and Reagan immediately agreed. The leaders and their entourages frantically prepared to convene in the haunted house in Reykjavik. It was cold and blustery when the delegations arrived in Reykjavik on Saturday, the 11th of October, 1986. The American entourage took one wing of Hofty House, the Soviets the other. The two leaders were scheduled to meet twice that day and once more on Sunday morning before flying home. Only later did the full story of that weekend in Reykjavik emerge. The feverish atmosphere and close confines of Hofty House seemed to have made the two leaders giddy as they glimpsed what they might accomplish. The staffs of both men were shocked by the pace of the negotiations. Now, Gorbachev had opened with a radical suggestion for both sides to cut the number of long-range strategic missiles by half and to eliminate intermediate-range missiles based in Europe altogether. Reagan went a step further. It would be fine by me, he said, if we eliminated all nuclear weapons. We can do that, Gorbachev replied. Suddenly, a major breakthrough was in sight, and the Americans became increasingly excited. The two delegations went back and forth well into the night, busily drafting and redrafting proposals. Office space was sparse, so Americans created an extra desk by taking a door off its hinges and laying it across an old bathtub. Then, in the final hours of Sunday, the two sides reached an impasse. Neither was prepared to move on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Gorbachev insisted that America agree to confine Star Wars research to the laboratory for a decade. Reagan retorted that he had promised the American people he would not give up the SDI and he wouldn't go back on his pledge. Since it was defensive in nature, he said he'd be happy to share the technology with the Soviets once it was perfected. I doubt it, snapped a tired and disappointed Gorbachev. You won't even share milking machine technology with us. Reagan walked out of the meeting angry and upset. He was convinced, quite mistakenly, that Gorbachev's dramatic proposals had merely been an elaborate ploy to kill off the Strategic Defense Initiative. Before they parted, Reagan said, "I still think we can make a deal." Gorbachev replied wearily, "I don't think you want a deal. I don't know what else I could have done." As Air Force One flew back to Washington, Reagan's aides struggled to string together a narrative that would explain to the media contingent at the back of the plane what had just happened. The president had met with the cunning Soviet leader who'd tried to trap them into abandoning the SDI, but Reagan had been too shrewd to fall for that. Contrary to rumors, the president, they said, had not offered to eliminate all nuclear weapons, only ballistic missiles over a 10-year period. But Reagan wouldn't stick to the story. In Washington, he told an amazed US congressional leadership that he had indeed offered to eliminate all nuclear weapons if the Russians were prepared to accept the SDI. The congressional leaders shook their heads at the president's recklessness. The depressing reality that was ignored at Hofty House was that neither side could have delivered on their bold proposals. Reagan had failed to consult Congress, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or America's allies, who were all opposed to the idea. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was horrified. She had no intention of giving up her nuclear weapons. Gorbachev, too, would likely have encountered multiple points of veto within the Soviet Politburo and the military. Even if both sides had reached an agreement that weekend, there was little prospect such a treaty would ever have been ratified. Still, those two intoxicating days in Hofty House had shown both sides how far the other was prepared to go. The following year, Reagan and Gorbachev met again in Washington and signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was a less ambitious but still very substantial agreement on nuclear arms reduction that committed both sides to destroying all their short and medium-range missiles based in Europe. In '93, President Bill Clinton downsized the SDI and shifted its focus to ground-based systems. The dream of a Star Wars missile defense system was abandoned. Today, Herfley House is uninhabited and closed to tourists, although it is sometimes used by the Icelandic government for formal occasions. The whitewashed house stands quiet and lonely on its wind-blasted patch of land, seemingly shunned by its neighbours. Traffic roars past on the adjacent waterside motorway. On the day that Kari and I come to see it, I strain to see a figure at the window, but there's nothing there. That night, I call Kim, my wife, in Australia, as she loves poltergeist stories. Now, neither of us really believes in ghosts, but we lived with one for a while, not long after we got married. We were living in an apartment building in Sydney that was once part of a colonial jail. Whatever was in the place, it wasn't a malevolent thing, but it performed all kinds of uncanny tricks on us. The strangeness went on for months. One night, while we were washing the dishes together, Kim looked up at the ceiling and said, "You're welcome to stay, but please don't freak us out." After that, the disturbances stopped. Kim suspects poltergeist is some kind of weird manifestation of shame and repressed rage that we don't yet fully understand. On the phone that night, I told her the sad tale of Solborg Jonsdottir, her incestuous affair, and the baby killing. Kim found the nub of it right away. "She did something she thought was right," said Kim, "but everyone else thought was wrong." Thank you. So that's it for our presentation, and we're very happy to take questions from you now. I can suggest a first question. Will someone please ask me if I ate the rotten shark? Hand, please. We got a microphone. Chris, you got a microphone? So I need someone to ask me if I had the rotten shark. Someone just do that for me, please. Jane over there, thank you. Yes.
Did you eat the shark and did you stink for weeks afterwards?
No, I didn't eat the rotten shark. This is Iceland's national dish, and it's called hakatl.
It's not quite called that, but it's called halkatl.
Yeah, that's what I said. Hakatl.
One of the charming things about Richard is that he fancies that he has an ear for language.
I do.
You know, there's that volcano that went off in 2010.
Yeah, I was calling it Eyjafjallajökull for a long while.
Then I said to you, Richard, I'm sorry, but you've got that slightly wrong. It's Eyjafjallajökull, and then you tried a bit.
And I learned it. I spent 3 weeks learning how to say it, and I got it eventually. Eyjafjallajökull.
See, that's not quite right. And,
yes, it is.
And when you hear that every day on a road trip...
No, it's right, it's right.
It's enough to drive you mad.
Yeah, it's right. After a while, I just talk like the Swedish chef going... So no, I didn't eat the rotten shark. This is Iceland's national dish. What they do is they get a Greenland shark, they beat it to death, they drag it inland...
Humanely.
And then they bury it, and they put stones on top of it to squeeze all the toxicity out, because you can't eat the meat of the shark straight away. And then they leave it to stew in its own juices for what? 3
months or something.
3 months or something. So it becomes perfectly rancid. And
it's a very good preparation technique. You let something go so far off that it becomes healthy again.
So no, I didn't eat the rotten shark. It's Iceland's national dish,
Very
which is kind of perverse, because they have this thing called the Icelandic hot dog, which is completely amazing. That ought to be its national dish. So anyway, I'm glad I got that off my chest. More questions, please, yes.
In your working with sagas and the stories of Iceland, did you engage at all with the trolls, elves and fairies of Iceland, those tales, the 13 Santas, all of those things?
Do you want me to tell you? I mean, they come a little bit later. Richard actually picked up on some of the later post-Reformation ghost stories and myths and folkloric tales. But this book is more focused on the earlier stories, and they're sort of pre-dwarves and elves. You don't get so much of that material. You do get a strong sense of the supernatural and magical in the sagas, but those particular stories that you're referring to, which are wonderfully rich, they come a bit later. Yeah.
But when we were in Isafjordur in the northwest of the island, this little town there, I uncovered this story of a witchcraft trial from the 17th century, which took place some 20 years before the Salem witchcraft trials, which was ghastly and completely compelling, and that's in here as well. And the way we know so much about it is because the priest who was leading the trial, who was pushing the hardest to have this father and son farmers executed and burnt to death on the stake, wrote the story of it. And he wrote a book called the Fidler Saga, which means the saga of my suffering. And as you read it, it's the most self-incriminating document I've ever read in my life. Because clearly the guy's having a nervous breakdown and suffering some kind of neurological disorder and probably influenza, which he takes to mean demonic possession. He effectively has these two men murdered, and he's proud of it at the end. So we find the prevalence of... I found in my reading that the practice of the old pagan magic never quite died away in Iceland, even after they became Christianized. There's a really lovely story about how, that Kari likes to tell, about how Iceland became Christianized in the year 1000 too.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point actually, Rich, that even though the sagas are very distant documents in a way, they're medieval. Icelanders are by nature superstitious and still have real faith in the way that the land carries spirits. They were pagan until the year 1000, and the question of whether to become Christian came up. King Olaf of Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason, was insisting that Iceland become Christian. And so the Icelanders decided there was only really one way to settle this, which was to just decide as a group at the parliament. They couldn't decide, so they gave it to one person to make a decision, the law speaker. And he took himself off and he covered himself in a blanket, and he spent a day and then a night underneath the blanket deciding the future of Icelandic religion. And when he emerged the next day, he said, I've decided what we're going to do. We're going to become a Christian nation, but if you conduct heathen practices, that's okay, as long as you don't get caught. And that became the Icelandic solution to the Christianization of Europe.
Very practical people they are, yes.
There's something about that that's very Icelandic, actually. Yeah.
Do we have time for another question? Yes. Questions?
I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay.
We went on a bit.
I'm interested if you know when the Icelandic horse came to Iceland. Did it come with the original settlers?
I'm sorry, I don't really know when that species becomes so separate. Of course, I know that now it's considered its own, and that it can't. Once an Icelandic horse leaves Iceland, it's never allowed back into Iceland. So, and I'm sorry, I don't know any more than that about it.
As I recall, the Book of Settlements, which is one of the foundational documents which describes the settlement of Iceland, does talk about the early settlers bringing their livestock with them.
I mean, they brought horses in the very beginning.
There would have been horses, I think.
Oh,
then.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But when it became identified as a separate breed, I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
Yeah, really
Somebody
beautiful.
in the room might actually know that.
We'll finish on another question.
Another question? Yes.
Yeah. I've got this one. This will be our last question, I'm afraid.
Kari, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Icelandic language? I'm curious as to how you acquired it and practiced it, and how that has informed your relationship with saga writing.
Yeah, well, it's been backwards and forwards. So I grew up speaking English and Icelandic at home. Mum only ever spoke to me in English, but obviously I spoke Icelandic in the schoolyard and out in the world. And then we moved to England, and I forgot all my Icelandic completely. And so going back to Iceland has always been about the landscape and the country, but it's also about language. And for me, imperfect Icelandic. So, you know, I can survive in Iceland with my Icelandic, but I'm aware of its imperfections. So in a way, that's part of the tension, isn't it, of going back to a country where you're from as a child, that you go back with with the 10-year-old's Icelandic, even once it's kind of reclaimed. So it's actually, to answer your question, language is at the very heart of my sense of what it means to be Icelandic, which for me is a slightly torn, relationship with a home I love very much. But of course, I'm Australian now as well.
It's not that hard. I picked it up in 2 weeks.
He is actually fluent in Icelandic.
Incredibly fluent.
He's very modest about it.
It's incredible. I speak in the Icelandic that I know, and people smile and nod all the time. It works really well for me.
They just weren't sure what he was saying.
Friends, everyone here, on behalf of the Church of All Nations, on behalf of HarperCollins, on behalf of Readings, to these two extraordinary storytellers, let's show our gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming along. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Thank you.